In 1757, after a taxation dispute with the Nawab of Bengal, the British East India Company defeated a force of over 50,000 Indian men with just 2,900 hired soldiers, two-thirds of whom, in fact, were Indian. By the late 18th century, the East India Company had a standing army of over 260,000 soldiers and effectively controlled India. The company, founded in 1602, was created not for imperialism, but instead for the lucrative trade available in India. The possibility of the company one day controlling the entire subcontinent would have sounded absurd. In 1700, India accounted for nearly a quarter of the world output, while Britain stood at just 3%. Yet, by 1764, Robert Clive of the East India Company had an opportunity that he could not resist. The decline of the Mughal Empire had created a power vacuum, and local leaders attempted to fill it, resulting in turmoil and political instability. After his victory in the Battle of Buxar, Clive wrote, "I can assert with some degree of confidence that this rich and flourishing kingdom may be totally subdued by so small a force as 2,000 Europeans." The loss at Buxar forced the Mughal Empire to sign a treaty and give the East India Company administrative control over Bengal, and thus a revenue stream of over £2 million per year through taxation. At this moment, a privately owned corporation had just gained the status of a sovereign nation and its ability to exert political control over the Indian population. However, over the years, with mismanagement, higher than expected expenditures, lower revenues, and mass starvation, the British East India Company found itself in need of a government bailout. In 1784, Parliament gave control of India to the Crown, effectively ending the dominance of the company. At the same time as private organizations were colonizing far-off lands, the ideas of capitalism and free market enterprise were being formed by thinkers such as Adam Smith. In 1776, Smith published The Wealth of Nations. His book contained many of the concepts that our economies are based on today. He also argued powerfully against colonization, slavery, and the monopoly granted to the East India Company by the British government. How could the same country, which in one regard upheld free trade and liberalism, allow and engage in subjugating and restricting the freedom of native populations? Was this an inevitable effect of capitalism? As Marx put it, the need of a constantly expanding market for its products chases the bourgeoisie over the whole surface of the globe? Or was this simply a possible outcome of uncontrolled capitalism mixed with government failure to create the preconditions necessary for a truly capitalist system? I argue for the former. Colonialism is incompatible with the modern and historical definitions of capitalism due to the lack of voluntary exchange and the need for government intervention beyond its place. Despite this reality, the capitalistic behavior of individuals and governments led to the restrictions on liberty experienced by both colonists and indigenous peoples. Before discussing the various merits and downsides of capitalism, we must first come to an understanding of how it came to be and what it is. Although components of capitalism certainly existed in many parts of the world before the rise of Europe, several factors set Europe apart. For example, they were the first societies to base most economic activity upon private exchange, implement the rule of law and citizenship, and establish economic status as more important than birthright. While of course not evenly distributed, the European capitalist system afforded citizens much better living standards and technology than the other non-industrialized nations. Adam Smith gave a clear picture of a capitalist system. He saw perfect liberty as a system that would allow people to make choices about where they worked and would enable them to switch occupations if they chose. He argued that self-interested competition among individuals would allow for commodities to be provided to society at prices they were willing to pay. In this way, like water finding level ground, resources would flow to where they are most valued. If a product was overproduced, its price would fall, and so would the profits of the manufacturers, causing some to leave the industry or others to decide against entering it. Smith believed that the role of government was to provide military protection, equal justice for citizens, and create public works that would benefit society, but were too expensive for an individual to take on. He argued that the costs of the colonies, and in particular, the war expenses for maintaining them, exceeded any sort of advantage that they may have gained through higher prices that suppliers could charge. To make matters worse, British consumers had to bear the burden of wartime expenditures through higher taxes and military service, while the sellers were able to collect the benefits. This reality was unlikely to change in Smith's mind, because the monopolists held major sway over Parliament. Considering how opposed the father of capitalism was to colonization, it is clear that colonization is incompatible with the historical definition of capitalism and its ideals. Our modern understanding of capitalism is very similar to the ideas of Smith. Private actors are allowed to own property and utilize it to promote their gain within a set of laws. The government's role is to protect the conditions that allow capitalism to function. Under this system, people have the right to decide to work for others and demand whatever the wage they choose. Likewise, employers have the right to hire whoever they want and offer whatever wage they want. Once again, we can see that definitionally speaking, colonization was incompatible with capitalism, as one of the cornerstones of colonial enterprise was to gain preferential trade status with colonies. This was achieved by banning trade with non-mother countries, restricting manufacturing in colonies, and imposing import tariffs. These were a few of the mercantilist justifications for colonization, all of which are in direct contrast to voluntary exchange. If an Indian entrepreneur wanted to start a manufacturing plant, he would be barred from doing so, and thus his right to manage his property as he saw fit would be violated. With an understanding of this definition of capitalism, let us identify what exactly colonialism and imperialism are. Colonialism is where one nation takes full political control of another, establishes laws, and has a settler population move into the newly acquired territory. Primarily European nations, but also Japan, engaged in colonization, often through violence, without regard for the will of the local populations. As previously mentioned, colonization was economically justified using mercantilist principles that stemmed from the idea that only a finite amount of wealth existed in the form of gold and silver in the world. Since most nations were on the gold standard, when a country exported more goods, or in other words, an inflow of gold, than it imported an outflow of gold, it would be able to maximize its wealth at the expense of other nations. Colonies were a natural side effect of mercantilism, as they were a guaranteed export market and allowed for the purchase of inputs, raw materials, without trading with other nations. Ultimately, mercantilism is entirely baseless. Smith identified that economically, trade between nations is no different than trade within a nation, because gold is simply a commodity. Smith, and later fully expanded by David Ricardo, identified comparative advantage, which means that nations will produce goods for which they have the lowest opportunity costs. Effectively, if Britain was more efficient at producing textiles than Portugal, and the Portuguese were better at procuring Indian pepper, then the nations would trade. This exchange would make both countries better off by providing consumers with lower prices and allowing producers to specialize in higher value-adding tasks. Even though capitalism and colonialism are definitionally opposites, their interconnectedness must still be reckoned. In the early days of exploration, the British envied the success of the Spanish Empire and tried, without a success, to find their own Peruvian or Mexican gold deposits. It seemed that the only way for expeditions to be profitable was to, in fact, raid Spanish possessions. Although piracy was initially suppressed by the British government, by 1585, Elizabeth I had incorporated it into British naval strategy. This private enterprise not only brought in vast profits for the privateers, but more importantly, strengthened British imperial control in areas such as Jamaica. By 1670, Port Royal in Jamaica had become a crucial asset to British colonial expansion, providing Britain with a major product: sugarcane. Sugar, along with tea, coffee, tobacco, and textiles, were some of the many products that helped create a mass consumer market in Britain. To meet the demands of British consumers, merchants from Britain and other countries traveled around the world to trade. Some of the initial voyages yielded profits as high as 200% in the case of the East India Company. Private involvement in colonization did not end with the demise of the East India Company. With the start of the Industrial Revolution in Britain, the West shifted to buying Asian products to selling them their manufactured goods. This change pushed colonized economies to focus on producing primary goods needed by European nations in manufacturing. It was for those raw materials that the European nations engaged in the scramble for Africa. In 1871, Cecil Rhodes entered into a partnership with the De Beers mining operation, which at the time faced fierce competition from other mines. By 1883, however, with the backing of the Rothschild Bank, Rhodes was able to execute several amalgamations, making De Beers the sole diamond supplier in the area. Rhodes did not stop there. In 1888, he received further backing from Lord Rothschild to exploit gold deposits available in Matabeleland, to which he gained access through a deceptive treaty with King Lobengula. Rhodes' newly formed British South Africa Company undertook this lucrative enterprise. When King Lobengula attempted to nullify the treaty, Rhodes sent in a force of 700 men, armed with newly invented Maxim guns, to dispose of the Matabele warriors. The African defeat was decisive. Only 4 company men died, compared to the 1,500 Matabele warriors. From simple privateering expeditions to the sophisticated financing of the Rothschild Bank, British expansion is in part a result of the capitalist drive for new markets and for profit maximization. Today, many have used this interconnectedness to condemn the free market system as something that is entirely evil and should be eliminated. This is a premature analysis. While it is true that the free market aided colonization, it also required the direction and sanction of the British government. Had the British government realized the value of not interfering with sovereign nations, they could have barred private individuals from possessing non-British territory without consent of its owners, and created laws to ensure clarity when it came to deal with other nations. The US provides an example of a capitalist nation that did not engage in substantial overseas colonization. After World War II, the British had amassed a major amount of debt owed to the US. Rather than choosing to take British imperial possessions as repayment, the US allowed democratically elected governments to take charge in former colonies. They chose to trade rather than to colonize. This decision-making shows that capitalism does not require the creation of colonies when proper legislation and attitudes are utilized. By separating the wheat from the chaff, one can see that capitalism has moved billions of people out of extreme poverty. In 1820, 94% of the world's population lived in extreme poverty. By 2015, that number was down to 9.6%, and this is undeniably a result of liberalization. The study of the link between capitalism and colonialism in the past naturally brings us to today and causes us to question if free trade is a form of exploitative neocolonialism, as some have argued. If free trade is exploitative, it would need to be structural and mutually beneficial. Structural, as we're looking at multiple nations, and mutually beneficial, since both parties must, by definition, be made better off to trade. Karl Marx explored how labor was exploited in this fashion. Marx argued that exploitation came not in the form of starvation or lack of necessities, as those were needed for the reproduction of the working class, but instead in the difference between necessary labor and actual labor. Given that in his mind, the only value of a commodity came from the amount of labor time needed to create it, plus the raw materials and capital, which also had come from past labor, the only way for the capitalists to make a profit was by paying workers less than the actual value that they created. Marx's analysis fails to account for several crucial factors. Firstly, Marx says nothing about how these businesses came to be and assumes they require no risk-taking, managerial coordination, or any other input besides labor to create value. It is undeniable that the entrepreneur creates value through these actions, as production would not take place at all without them. Additionally, it is outrageous to argue that the value of an item should come from the amount of labor time needed to create it, as the value of an object is subjective and depends on the marginal utility afforded to the end user. For example, the value of a kerosene lamp went down with the invention of electric light. Yet a light bulb might take the same amount of labor time to produce as a lamp. Value is determined by the people who use the commodity, the market. The question now becomes whether or not free trade is unfair. Trade is not about fairness, but instead about what people want and what they're willing to pay for products. It can produce unfair outcomes, but there are no efficient alternatives that would be fair. The best we can do is to use our resources as effectively as possible, and free trade promotes efficiency and maximizes total surplus. This means the price consumers are willing to pay is greater than the price that they actually have to pay, and the lowest price producers are willing to sell is less than the price at which they actually sell. This allows both groups to benefit. Consider an international market where the world price of a good is higher than its domestic price. Well, producers will export. Although this lowers consumer surplus, as they now must pay higher prices for the goods, it raises producer surplus by a larger amount. The total surplus is increased when nations trade. Conversely, when the world price is lower than the domestic price, producer surplus will decline, but the consumer surplus will increase by a larger factor. Thus, assessing the overall fairness of trade is difficult, given that at times producers will benefit more, while at other times consumers will benefit more. Despite this, one thing is for certain: nations engaging in trade increase their production possibility. This is a result of a comparative advantage, which is based off the opportunity cost of producing a good. The issue of neocolonialism seems to be more political than economic. The general understanding of neocolonialism is that formerly colonized nations have come under economic, political, and social control from more powerful capitalist nations. These nations use their economic power to coerce the smaller ones to do their bidding. If a nation refuses to cooperate with the West, then they will impose economic sanctions against that country and cripple their economy. Yet the fundamental issue with this line of thinking is that neocolonialism is not capitalist, for it is the threat of not engaging in free market trade that the West supposedly uses to subjugate former colonies. Neocolonialism requires state intervention to raise tariffs or embargoes against its enemies, two things that are not capitalist whatsoever. Supposedly, people who discuss the negative impacts of neocolonialism would support smaller nations raising tariffs and cutting trade relations with Western powers to gain complete autonomy, yet at the same time condemn the West for doing the same thing. Why does one set of people get the freedom that another does not? Should not capitalist nations be allowed to trade with whomever they please, just as the victims of neocolonialism do? Additionally, it would seem that neocolonialism has aided some former colonies. For example, China, through economic integration with the West, along with some tactful government planning, allowed them to move over 800 million people out of poverty. Although capitalism has major legitimate flaws, it has been to the detriment of global prosperity that some have called for its entire destruction. As Milton Friedman once said, capitalism is not a sufficient condition for freedom. It is a necessary condition for freedom. Wherever you have freedom, you have capitalism. So as long as capitalism is regulated in a way that keeps individuals from gaining too much power, it is the best economic system available. Thank you very much for watching this video. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and God bless.